Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the Healthy Planet Action Coalition bi-weekly general membership meeting. And today we are very fortunate to have with us um, Dennis Garrity. And Dr. Dennis Garrity is a systems agronomist and research leader whose career has been focused on the development of small-scale farming systems in the tropics. He is currently chair of the board of the Global EverGreening Alliance with 95 member organizations that are collaborating to implement massive scale programs on land restoration in the developing world. He leads the Alliance's campaign to evergreen the earth. The campaign advocates for achieving the goal to draw down 20 billion tons of CO2 annually from the atmosphere through evergreening practices that also enhance biodiversity and improve livelihoods in the tropics. He is Distinguished Senior Research Fellow at the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, Nairobi. He served as Director General of the Center from 2001 to 2011. He then served as Drylands Ambassador for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification from 2011 to 2018, emphasizing the role of agroforestry, evergreen agriculture, and land care as critical to sustainable land management. He is also a member of the board of Global Land Care, a worldwide effort to support grassroots community-based natural resource management. He is currently co-leading an effort to secure a global pledge among nations to restore a safe climate by accelerating carbon removals. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dennis.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ron. And as you know, I joined HPAC only quite recently, but it is a tremendous pleasure, indeed an honor, to be associated with this distinguished group of climate scientists, engineers, and other professionals of all types that have done such a clear job of developing a vision of the current plight of humanity and that you know basically what we must do to restore a climate for our children and grandchildren. So in these remarks, I would like to share some relevant parts of my journey to get here and discuss some thoughts about how my life experience may be helpful in supporting HPAC's mission to build a global movement, a movement to develop and implement a new climate restoration plan to bring the temperature back down to well below 1 degree C. I'm delighted and energized to support this mission that brings together the best science and engineering knowledge upon which to build such a global movement, but also to reach beyond that, to educate, inspire, and drive the political will to take the considered action necessary to enact such a plan, to cool, reduce, and remove. Back when I was in high school in the 1960s, the big looming global humanitarian disaster at that time was the prospect of a massive Asian famine. I was fortunate to have come across an article by Paul Ehrlich in the Smithsonian Magazine in our school library that described the scale of such a potential famine. There she is. And I read a book by two agronomists called Famine 1975, in which they projected that it would be impossible to adequately feed the population of Asia due to a galloping population growth in the face of stagnant food production. And that consequently, hundreds of millions of people would be starving by the mid-1970s. They discussed which countries might make it through okay with some US assistance, and which were already in such desperate straits that it wasn't smart policy to waste food resources on them. They called it triage, as in treating battlefield wounded, and India was in the lost category. This was not just a deep concern in countries in that region, however, who were already in near famine conditions, but it was shared by the US government, which was donating tens of millions of tons of wheat to India to assist the country and meet its massive food deficit. All this was a galvanizing epiphany for me, and it was then that I realized that I could combine the two things I most loved to do, farming and science, into a career in international agricultural development. So when I was 19 years old, I did a year of overseas studies at the Punjab Agricultural University in India, where I was able to witness the crisis firsthand. But while I was there, I was also surprised to witness the first glimmers of evidence that this crisis could be overcome. I saw the initial phase of the rollout of the incredible new varieties of wheat and rice in India that tripled the yield potential of these basic food grains. It was accomplished through excellent and creative agricultural science, supported by the United States and by foundations like the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, collaborating with Indian scientists. What they created was what we now call the Green Revolution. Over the coming decades, this amazing battery of new technology enabled India and many other countries to provide adequate food supplies to their people and to stabilize them politically for the road to democracy rather than revolution. The global food crisis has faded during recent decades. Food prices have gone into long-term decline, and by the turn of the century, the crisis was largely forgotten. Indeed, India, with its 1.4 billion people, is now a major food exporter. Now, how's that for amazing? Yet at the time, solving the Asian food crisis seemed totally intractable to most people. The analogy here is that global heating has reared its head as a crisis that also seems almost intractable. But I see and I believe, along with many of you, I'm sure, that humanity can similarly rise to this new existential challenge affecting hundreds of millions of people, and that we will apply the appropriate science and technology needed to put global heating into our rearview mirror. I went on to complete my studies at Ohio, Nebraska, and the Philippines, and prepare myself for an agricultural science career. And I went back to the Philippines after my PhD, eventually leading the farming systems and agroecological research at the International Rice Research Institute, which is the center that became the mother lode of rice science and the new rice varieties underpinning the Green Revolution. In the 1990s, I launched a new phase of my career to develop strategies for land restoration in Southeast Asia. And more recently, I spent 2 decades in Africa as director of the World Agroforestry Center based in Nairobi. In 2012, I launched the Evergreen Agriculture Partnership, which has now become the Global EverGreening Alliance. This alliance has brought together a coalition of 95 member organizations that include most of the big global conservation organizations, such as the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International, and the largest humanitarian and development organizations in the world, such as World Vision and Catholic Relief Services, supported by an array of research organizations, such as the World Resources Institute in Washington. The Alliance's mission focuses on 2 things. First, it's developing and implementing a portfolio of very large restoration projects in Africa, Asia, and around the world based on the immense capacities of these 95 organizations. And second, it is spearheading a global campaign. A campaign to evergreen the earth by fostering commitments to a global movement with ambitious goals and targets to restore hundreds of millions of hectares of degraded land throughout the developing world, thereby enhancing the livelihoods of the most vulnerable people in the world to climate change and enhancing ecosystems to protect biodiversity. The analysis and roadmap that we developed as the foundation for our global campaign has led us to project that evergreening the earth with nature-based solutions has the potential to be removing at least 20 billion additional tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere annually by 2050. It's an audacious goal, but it is increasingly likely to be achieved because of the hundreds of land restoration projects that are already being implemented by our member organizations and many other partners, and the positive trends in land use that are currently taking hold in many parts of the world. We are building the advocacy networks and collaboration to foster a massive global movement to evergreen the earth. We know that nature-based solutions are currently responsible already for removing 99% of the carbon dioxide that is being drawn down from the atmosphere, and this is unlikely to change much for many decades. All other solutions amount to about 0.01% of that drawdown potential. Now, the Global Carbon Project is a coalition of scores of scientists that provides the IPCC with its authoritative annual estimates of emissions and removals. And they report that currently positive land use changes happening throughout the world are removing 10.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. That is the orange bar in this figure. This enormous level of removals is a result of reforestation efforts, land restoration, regenerative agriculture practices, and the positive reversion of marginal agricultural land to forest. Therefore, our EverGreening campaign is simply aiming to triple this current rate of removals through positive land use change. That, by the way, is a far more realistic goal than, for example, to increase direct air capture by tens of thousands of times from its current level. This drawdown from positive land use change is in addition to the capture of CO2 by natural terrestrial ecosystems, which are removing another 12.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere per year. That's the green bar. And then there is the drawdown of carbon dioxide by absorption in the oceans, which accounts for an additional 9.2 billion tons of net CO2 removals, which is the gray bar. So all in all, evergreening the earth will make a substantial contribution to eventually stabilizing and restoring a safe climate. There are, as you know, many such methods for carbon removals with encouraging potential to remove large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, as shown in this figure from the chapter of the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report last year that reviewed the prospects for carbon removals. For example, the land-based methods alone could remove anywhere from 6 to 146 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. This is an encouraging story. A year ago, as I was discussing all this with Nigel Topping, former climate change high-level champion for the UNFCCC, we were conversing about his success in launching the Global Methane Pledge to establish clear targets for reducing human-induced methane emissions. The Methane Pledge was spearheaded by the United States and the European Union and was launched at COP26 in Edinburgh. It now has over 150 signatories and an ever-improving process for setting targets and tightening national commitments, and for monitoring methane sources around the world with amazing new satellite detection methods. At one point in our conversation, Nigel threw me a challenge saying, "Why don't you land a global pledge among the nations to commit themselves to establishing quantitative targets for carbon removals as well, and to commit to dramatically accelerate their investments in developing and scaling up removal solutions?" I took up the challenge and I shared this idea with our Global EverGreening Alliance Council of about 100 senior fellows. We established a core team of about 25 senior professionals around the world, and we launched a full court press to engage in dialogue with climate policymakers in a couple of dozen countries to identify those nations willing to champion or endorse the pledge. We partnered with the Global Carbon Removals Partnership based at Arizona State University and the High Level Champions Carbon Removals Team. In particular, we collaborate with Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, head of the partnership and newly appointed as head of the Champions Removals Team. We decided to focus on making the removals pledge a South-led effort, spearheaded by the developing countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. Currently, we have 6 countries that have endorsed the pledge, and there are another dozen or so countries that are seriously considering an endorsement. In addition, we have over 30 non-state actors, particularly non-governmental organizations and companies that have also endorsed the pledge. We are looking to build on this and formally launch the Global Carbon Removals Pledge later this year. But as I worked with Dr. Kagram and our Global Removals Pledge team, I began to realize that although there is great promise in ramping up terrestrial and ocean removals during the coming decades, and this will ultimately be absolutely necessary for restoring a safe climate, neither the process of reducing emissions or of accelerating removals was likely to forestall the planet surpassing 1.5 degrees C or even 2 degrees C during the next couple of decades. I had assisted the colleagues at Exeter University in the UK to convene the Global Tipping Points Conference in September 2022, and I was deeply aware that several crucial tipping points have already been triggered or on the verge of being triggered as we approach 1.5 C, and that by 2 degrees, a whole battery of dangerous tipping points is likely to be exceeded. Then along came the paper by James Hansen and colleagues on global warming in the pipeline, and they made a compelling case that there are several other processes that are already in train to accelerate the rate of global heating, quite apart from the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. These include the massive reduction of global albedo due to the decline of Arctic and Antarctic ice, and the Faustian bargain that we've made by reducing particulate and aerosol pollution by maritime shipping and other sources, as several of you colleagues in HPAC are working on correcting currently. Thus, I realized that regardless of our best attempts to reduce emissions and ramp up removals, it is not at all likely that temperatures can be stabilized by these measures alone, no matter how successful they are. But what is most likely is that the global temperature rise will accelerate and possibly get out of control in the coming decades. I was particularly jolted by the amazing video by Ani Pokela that was widely shared by Jim Hansen. It was called 1.5 C Gone Without Climate Intervention. So what's the plan? Now, here's an extremely articulate young woman challenging us to wake up to the stark realities. Indeed, she elegantly threw it in our faces. You've quite failed to tackle this emergency that will be inherited by the younger generation. So indeed, what's the plan? And of course, the answer is there is no credible plan. There is no holistic, integrated plan to address this crisis. Humanity is sleepwalking into disaster. And this is, as many of you have been exclaiming for years. Sir David King has been assisting us with many superb contacts to climate policymakers in our removals pledge work, and I've been deeply inspired by his vision in establishing the Cambridge Climate Repair Center with the mission Reduce, Remove, Refreeze. So late last year, I embarked on a deep dive into that third major basket of solutions that could complement reductions and removals, which is direct climate cooling. And I began reading. I read 6 books on solar geoengineering last year, examining research papers on the topic and listening to HPAC videos. I was particularly impressed by the analysis of Doug McMartin at Cornell University, among others, through which I developed a clearer understanding of the science and engineering surrounding such solutions as marine cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosol injection. And as Overshoot Commission advisor Ted Parson noted recently, the research is shockingly positive. I was intrigued by how these solutions are based on replicating the natural effects of sea spray on brightening clouds, or on replicating the natural effects of volcanic eruptions that spew enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The Mount Pinatubo case was personal. I lived through the eruption here in the Philippines in 1991, and at one point I was actually trapped by the enormous ashfall. But that's a story for another day. It was, however, a revelation to learn that the injection of Mount Pinatubo of some 25 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere had gone on to cool the planet by about half a degree for more than a year and a half or so. And it continued to depress global temperatures significantly from trend for several more years afterwards. My deep dive made it obvious to me that the research and the risk analysis that has been done shows that the deployment of direct cooling options could help cap global heating before it gets out of control and present a relatively low risk compared to non-deployment, that they are relatively inexpensive and technologically feasible. I was particularly impressed by the modeling results of judicious cooling that have shown that we could protect the world's agricultural systems from severe disruptions due to global heating. And it is food supply, food production that is one of the most important risks of our global heating process. These methods could recool the oceans also to forestall the emergence of absolutely disastrous super typhoons that have wreaked havoc recently here in the Philippines.
Sorry, your slides are frozen on Annie's. Is that intentional?
Let me see. Yeah, it was.
Okay.
It was. And I was just saying that these super typhoons here in the Philippines have been extremely disruptive and virtually also destroyed the island of Fiji, Puerto Rico, and several other Caribbean islands. Indeed, my biggest nightmare is a super typhoon sweeping across Manila and my hometown of Los Baños nearby, creating a path of destruction that would affect tens of millions of people. I participated in COP28 and attended and spoke at a number of events on carbon removals, but I also attended several events on solar geoengineering as well. And Ani's words kept reverberating. What's the plan? I was convinced that I had to come to grips with this challenge and get involved in efforts to ensure that humanity does develop and implement such a plan and find the political will to implement it. Let's see. But the question was, how? By the end of 2023, I was aware that the work of HPAC to grapple with this challenge was really quite significant. And I read the excellent papers by Ron Bayman, Graham Taylor, and other colleagues at HPAC that called for such a plan in line with HPAC's concept of the climate triad: cool, reduce, and remove to restore the climate. And with HPAC's mission to ensure that there is a climate restoration plan that will limit global warming to below 1 degree. So during the last couple of months, I joined HPAC and began reaching out to the HPAC leaders to discuss how I might lend my experience in advocacy on behalf of land restoration, regenerative agriculture, and carbon removals to help develop the advocacy pathways that could lead to a global movement to create the holistic plan on climate cooling and to implement it. These brainstorms with Ron Bayman and Suzanne Reed, Herb Simmons, and Graham Taylor were inspiring. And the discussions have challenged me to think about some of the pathways that could be pursued in line with the directions that HPAC has already been moving. I now want to close out by sharing some ideas that attempt to build on what HPAC has already been discussing along these lines. Your Susan Reed is a powerhouse of deep advocacy and communications experience, clearly, and what a tremendous asset she is to the HPAC organization. Last year, Susan proposed some key steps in building an advocacy effort, and she proposed, among others, an update of the HPAC vision document to serve as the primary messaging and advocacy document. And she noted that she could include the next steps needed to integrate climate cooling into the global climate change mitigation strategy. Also, she suggested to develop and engage key advocacy organizations to develop an advocacy strategy, identify key target individuals and audiences, and develop advocacy materials. She urged HPAC to start planning for COP29 engagement, including pre-meetings, agency development, and strong participation in COP29 itself, which is something I hope we could discuss. And finally, based on the success in implementing the actions above, for HPAC to consider becoming a nonprofit organization, a direction that I would strongly endorse. Also, in November 2023, Herb Simmons developed a set of recommendations that he has proposed to the leadership team as well. He proposed that HPAC develop a strategic plan to align the efforts, expand the active participation of members through organized campaigns involving lots of personal contacts. He noted that the five large communities that should be targeted with individualized strategies, scientific community, environmental nonprofits, public and private decision-making elite, the bottom-up climate scientists, particularly in the global south, and the media. I think he was right on target there. He also proposed the establishment of an advocacy committee whose goal would be to develop a detailed advocacy strategy. And finally, to publish a working paper on governance, noting that governance is the most legitimate and probably controversial of all the issues surrounding global cooling. Well, I'd like to close my remarks by sharing a few additional thoughts on developing an advocacy roadmap. I think that the primary initial step at the moment should be to develop an advocacy core team to lead the charge on these actions. And I'd be very happy to help in organizing this advocacy group and in supporting its activity starting right away. Second, the political will to foster an integrated new climate restoration plan depends on a broad-based movement that mobilizes committed people throughout the world to raise their voices and demand such a plan. And it calls for transformational advocacy on many fronts. Here in the United States, HPAC might take a leaf out of the playbook of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which I am also a member, which has managed to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people across the country to join local chapters and to lobby for effective climate action, particularly at the state and federal levels. The CCL has now become an international body as well, with chapters in scores of countries around the world. Likewise, I think it would not take too much effort to mobilize internationally. We could reach out to places like India, where I have many friends at high level, to connect the cooling agenda with their fears of devastating heat domes, to which northern India is particularly susceptible, These could threaten the lives of millions of people in India, as highlighted in the book Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. We could cultivate voices in the Philippines and in the 46 nations of the Association of Small Island Nations, small island states, who are very fearful of the short-term existential threat of Category 5 and Category 6 super typhoons and the medium-term threat of sea level rise. We could mobilize in East Africa, that has just experienced the longest drought in recorded history with several years of failed rainy seasons. Massive crop failures there have put millions of people into near starvation conditions. In fact, I think we can get all of Africa on board through my contacts at the Africa Union. And of course, we will also want to mobilize in close collaboration with sympathetic colleagues in Europe as well, and so on around the world. Personally, after participating in overcoming one great global crisis on food security during my lifetime, I find myself now girding up to get more deeply involved in addressing the current great global emergency to restore a cooler, safer climate. And obviously, you are all thinking likewise. I'm feeling confident that once again, humanity will be up to the task, although the situation from current perspectives looks pretty bleak, and that yes, our efforts will succeed in time. Please reach out if you'd be interested to engage in more conversation with me further on this. I very much enjoy discussions and brainstorming to set our dials in the right direction. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity, the invitation, and I turn the mic back to Rob, I believe.
Thank you, Dennis. That was excellent, superb talk in my opinion. Perhaps you want to, if you could pause
Yeah.
yeah. And I am open to questions. I don't know. I personally find difficult to challenge any of your thinking in any way. But of course, what we want to do is try and enhance it and elaborate. So let me start with, it looks like Greg. Greg?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. Regarding greening, a couple things. What I'd be interested, perhaps you covered it and I wasn't paying attention, but what is the rate at which you're ramping up at this point toward the hopeful 20 gigatons a year? That's one thing. And then the other is just a general question about greening, which it reveals my ignorance, but greening is a one-time shot where you can store so much in green plants or whatever, trees, but once you've greened the whole earth, that's unlike in the old days when the dinosaurs gave us, whatever, sucked it up and turned it into oil. It eventually goes back. So it's a steady state. You green to so far, and then it's in steady state. Is that correct? And so those are my two questions.
Excellent questions, and you're quite right that once you do reach a saturation phase, you will have a leveling off of the absorption of CO2 from atmospheric drawdown. But the fact is, we're a long way from that. I mean, we've lost about half of the tree cover of the globe. And there is enormous potential for storing carbon in our ecosystems. And if you think of this whole process as a time-averaged carbon drawdown on landscapes, you can see how the whole globe can become an absorber of CO2 for a very long time. Concerning the rate at which we're proceeding, as I mentioned, currently, Global Carbon Project estimates that positive land use change, which is the regreening, is responsible for about 10.6 gigatons of carbon removals per year. And what we aim to do is triple that over the next 3 decades. In other words, triple the rate at which that would be increasing. So then we would be up to over 20 gigatons per year by mid-century. And given the large starting momentum that we have, and the fact that over the last few years there's been an enormous increase in restoration momentum around the world, I do expect we're going to be seeing that 10.6 begin to ramp up over time. But as I emphasized, that I thought this all was very, very encouraging, but I do feel that the rate at which it's going to happen is not going to be anywhere near rapid enough to be able to forestall the kind of accelerated temperature increase that we're now seeing happening due to all these processes, and that we cannot depend on removals and reduction of emissions to be able to save the day. We simply must be contemplating the ways in which we could cool the earth through the mechanisms of stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, and a number of others.
Mike?
Thank you, Dennis. I thought that was fascinating talk. So it seems to me to get on the COP29 agenda. Well, I guess what I should say is I asked a colleague of mine who actually helped write the OSTP plan for the United States, and his comment was, "How can you expect us to do more? Nobody has raised the issue and gotten it on a COP agenda yet." And what's needed is to somehow get it on the COP agenda for discussion. It's all well and good to have activists sort of out around things, but if you're going to get it serious, you need COP to have a real discussion of it. And so the challenge is finding some countries that would actually make sure they get on the agenda. You'd think island nations would be one that would be more than willing to push it, and some others. But part of the trouble, it seems, is it's seen as a ploy of the fossil fuel industry to continue burning fossil fuels. And somehow it has to be done as being something in addition to what is going on now, not as a substitute for what should go on with respect to mitigation. So I'm wondering how you see getting it, getting these countries to start raising it, because the issue has to be raised very soon. So it goes through all the preliminary meetings they have to get on the final agenda of things. So
yes, an excellent question, Mike. And I've done a bit of thinking about this based on my experience over the last decade and a half with COPs. First of all, it's probably unrealistic to imagine getting it on the agenda of the next COP. There's a way that these things evolve to get on the agenda of the COP itself, and we can certainly try, but I think there's some other things that we would probably be more effective in doing first to prepare the groundwork for that happening within the next couple of years. And I've watched how the carbon removals agenda has gradually and then rapidly gone up in the COP stratosphere. Or atmosphere. It's really interesting to see how fast it has moved in the last couple of years. It was quite off the agenda 2-3 years ago, and the enormous efforts of many of our colleagues in advocacy for carbon removals have done an enormous job of building the momentum there, so that it is no longer, as it was a few years ago, a non-issue. Another one of these issues that people didn't want to really deal with. It has now become front and center in the COP process. I do believe it will take at least a couple of years for cooling to actually achieve that. And cooling is more it's more controversial than removals. So it's a steeper climb. But we have some indications. Now, I'm sure you're aware that Switzerland has once again brought cooling to the UN Environment Convention, which is actually going on this week in Nairobi. The UN Environment Program is based right next door to the World Agroforestry Center, where I was based for almost 20 years. So that is an interesting thing, because Switzerland was batting for a declaration from the UN Environment Organization, UNEP, to do a special study on on cooling, and so this is one cog in the wheel, one step in the process. And I think some dialogue with countries like Switzerland that are reaching out in this area would be very, very interesting. To get something on the agenda, the official agenda for the COP, you need, I believe it is 2 or possibly 3 countries to put that agenda forward. So that's how the parties develop their agenda. And so it goes through these official delegations. And so Switzerland might be one to start the ball rolling. And I think that there's a lot of other things that we can do, and the removals community has been really effective in elevating the whole issue of removals by the way in which they've used their opportunities in the blue zone and the green zone for sponsoring events that would build more momentum behind the removals agenda. And I think we could take a leaf out of their experience and do the same to do it in the associated meetings of the COP as well. I could go on, but there is a whole lot that can be done to set the stage for an engagement that would get it onto the agenda of the COP over the next few years.
Okay, I guess I'd only say what it has seemed that it's not quite clear they can handle all of these multiple kind of things. I mean, the negotiators seem best at focusing on one thing at a time, rather than trying to handle an approach that has 3 or 4 or 5 different components. So,
of course, that's true, but I mean, it's also the case that the agenda can be expanded, but it takes a lot of lobbying to educate negotiators to understand the importance, the desperate, crucial nature of what we're talking about here, and get that message through. It's a long lobbying process, but it's great, as we were talking earlier, to get started, to get it moving, to start pushing the buttons, I think is the real opportunity.
thank you.
Robert.
Thanks so much, Dennis. Superb to have you on board. As I mentioned, I worked for the Australian government in dealing with the consultative group on international agricultural research and ACR, and so the sort of scientific heft that community can bring to the question of cooling is really immense, because what we face is really a concerted political campaign to exclude cooling. And it's a couple of years ago, I read this book, The Wizard and the Prophet, about Norman Borlaug, who you probably know personally.
Oh, yes, very well.
And who was the founder of the Green Revolution, with the spreading of high-yielding grains of cereals, and also the other. He's the wizard of the title, because he developed the technology that would be able to achieve the feeding of India. And
Yes.
But the prophet of the title is another really interesting character, and that's William Vogt, who was instrumental in saving the remaining sequoias of California, and had a vision of the environmental movement, and so had a real political role, and so it's this combination of the science and the politics that's really quite essential. Now, I'm sure that Vogt, with the environmental movement, they faced a similar sort of political opposition that we face in getting cooling onto the political agenda. And so looking back to that experience, and also the experience of the Green Revolution, I think it's a really good model for how to proceed. And I finally just wanted to thank you for citing Suzanne and Herb's summaries of the steps forward. They make immense sense, and so working out how to take those forward, getting other people on board is a really big challenge. And if you can help us with that, then that would be awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And it's a delight to know that we have folks like you that are that could relate to that CGIAR experience, and the fact that it has been a long drawn process, but now we look at food supply in the world as much less of an issue than it was back in the 70s, when it was top of the issue, not only for humanitarians, but for security people who were looking at Asia, really going down into a serious problem, because it could, many countries could not feed their populations. And we look back now and we find, miraculous things were done. I mean, India, a food exporter, and not just a minor, but a major food exporter now, where back then it was walking dead in food deficits. So it's just to say that as we look forward into the problem, it looks bad. But I think if we gird our loins and really take it on, there may be the day when we can look back like we do on the food problem in the future, hopefully.
I do want to add, though, that about 15 years ago, there was a fear of famine rearing its head again because of the price spikes of food. And so the whole association between climate change and food security has been a significant concern. And so, I wouldn't want anybody to be complacent about food security in a context of climate disruption, because without cooling, there is I think one of the great advantages of cooling is the potential to prevent the collapse of weather systems that just, like we've seen, big shortfalls in, for example, North American food production due to heat and drought. And so extreme weather really does present a significant potential risk to food security.
Absolutely, and I think that connection is such a crucial, fundamental connection in what we're doing here. because I can't think of anything more serious in terms of disruption globally than a food scarcity on the global level. And as you say, cooling appears from the research that I've been seeing to be able to actually equitably equitably cool the earth without disruption of food systems. In fact, preserving the status quo as opposed to changing it. And it's one of the main reasons that I'm so interested in this topic is that I believe food security is ultimately the major political instability factor that can be so terribly effective in causing great political instability.
Daniel?
Hi, Dennis. Thank you for your talk. It's you're very interesting. I was doing research actually for Friends of the Earth about just over 10 years ago. They commissioned me to do it was about 3 months of research into impacts on climate from the food system and vice versa. And before that, in fact, I did an NMC looking at biofuels for a huge retailer. I did 50 million miles a year in trucks, and my conclusion included the fact that there's no way that we can have agricultural biofuels sustainably on a large scale without first tackling the issue of livestock and how the whole land use indirectly and directly for livestock, particularly ruminants and of course cattle, was so massive compared to any impacts from biofuel crops. It just, I think it dwarfed it at least tenfold the amount of land for cattle compared to all the biofuel production in the world at that time. And of course, the issue of food security, and also trying to have land use change that's going to use, sequester more carbon. Do you think we can reach those targets you're talking about, tripling the 10 gigatons a year of sequestered carbon from land? Can we reach those targets and preserve a food system that's sustainable without without at the same time changing our animal agriculture, particularly, particularly obviously ruminants?
No, I don't. But I think that our animal agriculture is going to change quite dramatically over the coming decades. There is an entire new industry developing along the lines of protein, artificial protein, and the artificial meats. I mean, the faux meats that are being developed now that can in fact have a major effect as they begin to get cheaper than real meat from cattle and other animals. So over the next decade, we may begin to see a turning point in this whole process, which could actually make more healthy and proteinaceous foods artificially from fermentation processes, like we make beer, we make protein, and put it into foods. And so there is some really interesting stuff being done right now on this, and it's still hidden from most people. But if it is successful over the next decade, we could start to see the enormous momentum of this constantly increasing global livestock population begin to dampen and reverse, because they're predicting that we're going to be humanity is going to need something like double the amount of animal protein over the next 20-30 years with the increase in prosperity around the world. So we've got a problem with land use that is extremely concerning, and I see this as a countervailing opportunity to do. And if that occurs, then land will be released from animal feed production and from grazing, to the extent that there will be an enormous increase in available land for putting back into rewilding and other forms of land sequestration. So there is a great possibility that this whole process could reverse if it's successful.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm gonna because before we, as Greg has already spoken, before we start second questions, I thought I'd jump in. Like yourself, I'm economist, as you know, and a radical economist. In my case, a heterodox economist who spent many years trying to foment progressive policy regarding social justice and class struggle and so forth. Actually, my dad was a development economist, so I actually wanted to go work internationally, but I never really pulled that off. So, so I have with regard to that, I am very concerned about social collapse as you know, sort of apparently like you, we have natural systems, you know, moving toward a more chaotic and unstable situation that is extremely concerning and full of risks. But we also have social systems moving in that direction. I find, you know, as people become more fearful and more insecure, they become meaner, and societies become meaner, and we start electing these folks that just want to put up walls and you know, protect my own and the hell with everyone else kind of attitude. And that's a huge danger. So, you know, it just seems absolutely imperative to try to reduce this as much as possible, just to achieve progress, you know, in whatever dimensions we're considering. So that's just as a general comment. But for more specifically, you know, we've been, as Mike has mentioned, particularly with our latest initiative, which is the trying to, we did get our open letter forwarded to the General Secretary of the International Maritime Organization. And so, you know, they, you know, hopefully are considering it, hopefully seriously. But it is hard, you know. Along with that, we were hoping to get some small island countries. You know, Mike in particular has been trying to work with his contacts, and we have Rebecca Bishop also trying to work on that. And so or other nations to even if it's not the UNEP, you know, the IMO, you just have to have standing. And I think those countries would have standing just to say, yeah, we support this idea, which is to relax the bunker fuel, the dirty, you know, sulfate heavy fossil fuel that ships have historically used. And well-meaning regulation to reduce that, because the sulfates do have, you know, harm to humans and other species. But we found that we cited a study in that letter saying that, you know, just relaxing that over the open ocean outside the IMO emissions control zones would have you know, most of the benefits of regulating that would still apply if you kept those regulations in place in the ports, where apparently the ships tend to idle for long times with their engines going and spew this stuff all over the place. So that's one part of it, and the other part is to use some of the techniques in our paper, in our cooling paper, to try to offset. You know, for going forward, when we don't want to use these fossil fuels at all, particularly going forward, we could try to replace some of the beneficial cooling that's emanated from these ships. You know, spewing this aerosol precursor and cooling the maritime channels of the ocean, but through marine cloud brightening or tropospheric climate catalysts. We have a couple of those methods, and those could perhaps be released from ships. We're not claiming that this is the optimal method, but the ships are out there and they've been doing it in the past. It seems like, politically it would make sense to try to replace that with something, even if it's not optimal, and replace it with something that would have a more benign impact on humans. So my question was, if you have any any pointers, among certainly your contacts or your colleagues' contacts, or any way to I mean, it would be very helpful. They're having a meeting in March. It's the Marine Environment Protection Committee of the IMO. And hopefully, if they are considering this proposal, it would be very helpful to have folks, representatives from around the world, chiming in and saying, "Hey, you got to look at this. This is an important proposal." I sent them, you've probably seen the monthly temperature graph from the New York Times is just completely off the charts for 2023. So, that might have helped. But anyway, I'll shut up. Yeah.
So your question was whether I would have any idea of how to mobilize on this particular issue. Unfortunately, governments are highly fractionated into different departments, and obviously this is something that goes beyond the climate change representatives of a country and into other ministries, other departments. And so I couldn't offhand know how I might, have any idea of how to bridge those gaps and be able to lobby across that divide. It's something I could give some thought to, and I suppose with the small island nations you have less of a problem because there's fewer people in their bureaucracy, but it's not easy to take, for example, your connections with climate change delegations and get them to influence people who are working in other parts of the government. So I'll note that down, and we can have an offline discussion about how we might be able to get some pressure going on that, working from the climate side.
Thank you, Dennis.
Ron,
okay.
Could I just mention that
Yeah.
Aria has put a question into the chat.
I'm sorry.
And, she said there that she can't put her microphone on, so it at some point would be good for Dennis to have a look at Aria's question, if that's all right.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I saw Aria, and then she disappeared from the queue. But if it's the microphone issue, yeah. Dennis, perhaps you want to tackle Aria's question before we move on to Greg.
Just trying to locate it here. I wonder if you could read it.
There, let me see.
Would you like me to read it out, Ron?
Yes, please.
Yes, please do that.
I'm not sure, Aria says, I'm not sure why, but I don't seem to be able to turn on my camera or turn off my mute. I just wanted to share that I think a sharp explainer video to a mainstream audience could go a long way for messaging. Also, we could coordinate with American Sustainable Business Council partnerships for lobbying, hopefully. Would love to participate in regular conversations about messaging and invite my boyfriend who works in advertising. I have been wanting to get him involved. Funding would help greatly in getting quality marketing outside the scientific community.
Okay, so it is not a question. It is it is an affirmation that she would really be interested in working with us. And do we have her contact details? Can we get back to
her? She's on the call, but she just can't.
So I'll plan to see if we could start a bit of a dialogue and put some ideas together with her.
Yeah, fundraising for messaging is such an important topic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron.
Garrity was a former steering circle member and has quite, been very active with the group for a long time. So yeah, that would be very helpful. I think we should, so before, again, so Suzanne, I think we want to get as many people their questions before we get repeat questions. So Suzanne, so it's all yours.
Yes, I wanted to circle back to the end of Dennis's presentation when he talked about steps forward for us, because we strayed a bit and we're talking about one-offs, this and that, without focusing on what he noted in terms of the recommendations that both Herb and I have made previously and that we've discussed in several forums. So the idea of reaching out to this group or that group or whatever, it has to be tied into a strategy that has the incremental steps that need to happen, and some of which are already in play. Ron's been working very hard at trying to get a fiscal agent that would enable us to register as a nonprofit organization. And I've been a hesitant participant in that process, but because I always fear that we won't have the capacity to follow up on the promises that we made. What Dennis is presenting is an opportunity to collaborate with him and several organizations that already have not only nonprofit status, but entree to various forums in which we've participated ad hoc, but not had a continuous or solid relationship with. So I wanted to turn back to the opportunities that might be presented by his organizational affiliations, and also look to the processes that occurred, not only that they're pursuing now with the carbon removal, but also that happened around the methane resolution that was passed in the last COP. So if I properly interpret what Dennis is suggesting, is that with preparation and good work in the next year or two, we would get a climate cooling resolution on the COP agenda. And as Mike has pointed out, that requires working from the ground up, starting with these agenda formation committees, and also things, groups like the island states and other actually developing countries have their own subgroups in which they also meet pre-COP. And so we would need a specific strategy for engagement. And it appears that he's offering us a relationship with organizations that already have an entree into these forums. So I'm going to turn the question back to the members and ask, what is the interest of this organization to contribute some capacity to developing a strategy and executing a strategy of contact and persistent and consistent messaging to work towards a climate cooling resolution being presented at the COP in I think it would be 31. And the time to start to do that is now. That's my question.
Dennis, I think Suzanne was kind of, speaking to HPAC at large, but go ahead, please.
So yes, that's why I remained silent. Because obviously I'm very supportive of that, that exploration and moving forward in that domain. But I think maybe to emphasize one thing that I mentioned in the talk, pulling together a lot of work, in a stepwise process, probably forming a group within the HPAC that is a group, it could be a small group, but a committed group to the advocacy mechanisms, to the advocacy promotion process that many of the other recommendations that Herb and Suzanne mentioned. So in order to get to work on all these things, 1, 2, 3, you need a cohesive group that can meet regularly and develop their plans for how they can, push the buttons. And I think that's a kind of underpinning issue, is maybe pulling together such a group and getting started there. And as I said, I would be very, very happy to get engaged in that effort. And if I may speak for Suzanne, who may not be able to get on to give her kudos, I think she would be also very interested to participate as well.
Thank you. Yeah,
I'm not only interested, but I've been bugging this organization for this approach for a very long time. But having spoken, you and I spoke for a very long time, and I have to say, from a mercenary point of view, I'm very interested in the capacity that you bring to the table to help make this happen. So I would hope that others of our group are also inspired and maybe motivated by that to pitch in.
absolutely. Yeah. Dennis, I'm gonna propose on the agenda the first, for first item on the agenda to address this. So that's the steering circle, and hopefully we will definitely try to move forward with this. Our problem, I think, is, as Suzanne has alluded, has been we have the will, but it's very hard. Many of us are, so many people working on so many different things. It's very hard to implement, and so, but that will be something we can discuss. Greg, you've waited a long time, and we're nearing the end here. So, but go ahead, please.
Thanks. Sorry for jumping in for another question, but I did have a question for our speaker. You mentioned that you started looking at SRM and related within the last year or two, but you've been involved in trying to address climate change for decades. And this is so you were on a trajectory, and this is very interesting to me because we're trying to convince lots of people who are passionate about meeting this challenge to even consider SRM, and they're enemies. And so I just wondered, in your trajectory, did you start by dismissing it, or did you know about it? I'm just wondering if yours is a model for getting to other people.
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because of course, I heard about solar radiation management years ago. But of course, this was an area outside of my domain of work and technical expertise. And of course, I had no idea that there were even organizations like HPAC existing that were advocating for this. And so I think that one of the interesting things of my reaction to this when I learned about it and continue to see the debates is that this idea of this form of technology being a crazy idea, it seems to preface every discussion about solar radiation management. Well, of course, it seems like a crazy idea, but maybe it has some merit. That's the way the news articles always start. And I must say that personally, from the very beginning, I never thought it was crazy at all. I mean, as I said, I lived through the Pinatubo eruption, almost got buried in the ash at one point. And, the fact that volcanoes do this sort of thing is a great natural wand to wave that, this is not crazy science fiction. This is replicating natural process. Same with marine cloud brightening and many other cooling techniques. And it's so unfortunate that almost every book, every paper that I read somehow starts off with the fact that this is generally thought to be a crazy idea. And then they have to work backwards from there. But in my own view, as a scientist, I never thought this was crazy at all. I mean, it just seemed like a natural technological approach to a very serious problem, like developing new rice varieties, for overcoming a food security problem. So we've got ourselves in a hole here. I do believe the messaging, the way in which this subject has been presented, has dug so many people into a corner because they think they're battling a crazy idea when it's actually a very well-founded, scientifically underpinned concept with oodles of advantages, as well as some risks. But
yeah, well, I mean, on that note,
yeah.
Right, I get it. And on that note, I mean, a lot of the attribution of craziness comes actually from scientists, and and even people in the genome engineering community or the SRM community, as scientists, modelers, do that prefacing.
Yes.
So you see it even within this, even with our allies.
Yes.
And I'm not sure why they feel they have to denigrate. You know, it's like friendly fire, you know?
Yes, yes, it's so true. I see this in the scientific, the scientists talking about this who are proponents of it, but they don't want to be seen as being too, too excited. And so they will always preface it with this crazy idea notion. And this is very destructive, obviously, very destructive.
If you go back to the 1960s, if I might say, at the time then, and since 1870 to the 1960s, there were serious proposals to try and go ahead and melt the Arctic to get at its resources. So there were these proposals that were to, make large changes. And I think that set the tone for how the community thought about it. So you have to prove it's really necessary and good. And so I agree with you. All these articles start out with, oh, there's going to be great unintended consequences. There's all this stuff, as if somehow that's more an issue with climate intervention than it is with going ahead without it, which has all kinds of potential threats. So, yeah, but there is this bias, but I think it goes back way back, and that's why people wouldn't touch it for quite a time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good note to end on. I think we all agree on that point, because we've been battling that. It's all the risk. It just anyway.
Well, the real craziness is the idea that we don't have to worry about albedo, because albedo is the most tractable thing that we can, the most tractable lever to reverse global warming, and to say we can just ignore it, that's crazy.
Yeah. It's the moral hazard of just letting things kind of go to hell. That's anyway, if I might. So thank you very much, Dennis. This has been excellent, and as I said, we will definitely follow up on your work. And thank you very much for offering your help and engagement. And hopefully we can move on effectively, more raise this to the higher level that it should be on the world climate agenda.
And once again, I want any of our colleagues to get in touch. I put my email address up a couple of times, but would very much welcome further brainstorming and discussion about this with any and all of the folks on the call.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for joining us.